I travelled to New York in July to participate in the launch of Ireland's election campaign for a non-permanent or elected seat on the UN Security Council for the 2021-2022 term. During that visit, I attended and spoke at the event that formally launched Ireland's bid, and I also spoke at an event commemorating Ireland's record of 60 years of unbroken service on UN peacekeeping operations, and met with representatives from more than 30 African Union member states to emphasise Ireland's commitment to partnership with the continent and to highlight Ireland's Security Council campaign. I made a return visit to the UN earlier this week to represent Ireland at the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit, where leaders and representatives of more than 130 countries gathered to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the birth of Nelson Mandela as part of a week's events around the UN General Assembly. The political declaration from the summit reaffirms the signatories' commitment to the 3 UN pillars: peace and security, development and human rights, and also reaffirmed the importance of the multilateral system in preventing and resolving conflict. Ireland and South Africa led the preparation of this political declaration. While at the UN this week, I had the opportunity to meet bilaterally with the presidents of South Africa, Namibia and Colombia and Mozambique, and also the Prime Minister of New Zealand and the Foreign Minister of Malawi. During each of these meetings, we discussed our bilateral relations, as well as Ireland's campaign for UN seat on the Security Council, our seat on the UN Security Council. I also had the opportunity to discuss these issues in informal conversations with several other heads of state and government, including the Cypriot President, Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, Prime Minister Muscat of Malta, Prime Minister Ratas of Estonia, and also with senior UN officials, including Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohamed, and President of the General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garcés. Attendance at the UN also presents an opportunity to engage on an impromptu basis with many people in leadership positions in politics, international development and civil society. So among others I met informally were the widow of Nelson Mandela, Graça Micheál, the Secretary General of the Arab League, the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Mr. Naidu, and representatives of the governments of Monaco, Bahrain, Guyana and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm sure the House will agree that Ireland's credentials as a candidate for the Security Council are very strong, and since joining in 1985, Ireland has made a sustained contribution to the international community's efforts to tackle important global challenges like peace and security, human rights, international development, climate change and sustainable development. Ireland's candidature for a seat on the UN Security Council will deepen our engagement at a time when the multilateral institutions, which are so important to international peace and order, are under pressure. Before I travelled last weekend, I had the opportunity to meet President Mahmoud Abbas during his short visit to Ireland. We were joined by the Taoiseach and members of President Abbas's delegation, including Deputy Prime Minister Abu Amr, Foreign Minister Al-Maliki and Chief Negotiator Saïd Berkat. Our discussions covered the Middle East peace process, Ireland's support for the Palestinian people, and challenges facing the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian people in terms of peace, security, welfare and human rights. I emphasised to President Abbas the Irish Government's continued and consistent support for the aspirations of the Palestinian people. As regards further international engagements over the next 6 months, I'll attend the scheduled meetings of the European Council in Brussels on the 17th and 18th of October and the 13th and 14th of December. I'll also attend any extra meetings of the European Council that are scheduled, including the one suggested in November. I also expect to attend the next meeting of the British-Irish Council, scheduled for the 9th of November in the Isle of Man, and I'll continue my programme of bilateral meetings with other members of the European Council. I'll keep the House informed as and when details of any future visits and engagements are finalised for announcement.
Questions to the Taoiseach as they have been tabled. Deputy McDonald.
Thank you. Taoiseach, I think it's absolutely necessary that you move beyond articulating an aspiration of recognition of the Palestinian state and move to actually doing that. You've long fingered this issue. You say that you will do it in the context of a two-state solution at a time where that looks very remote and at a time of very great trouble in the Middle East and particularly in Gaza. And I would say to you it is the will of the Oireachtas to recognise the Palestinian state, and rather than waiting for the solution, the recognition of Palestinian statehood, I argue, is a necessary precondition, a necessary ingredient to advance towards that. As you say, on Monday you addressed the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit in New York, held in honour of the centenary of the birth of Nelson Mandela, and that is a considerable honour and privilege, and I hope it was a productive engagement. I read the speech, and you quite rightly held up our own peace process as a beacon of hope for building peace and reconciliation. The Good Friday Agreement remains a triumph of hope over despair, and it's as relevant today as it was 20 years ago. It is, of course, regrettable that 20 years on, the political institutions of the agreement aren't functioning. In the context of Brexit, the actions of Tory hardliners, the denial of rights by the DUP and the actions of a British government that is, in my view, undermining the agreement, it's absolutely essential that we recommit ourselves to the Good Friday Agreement, because those institutions are what's best for all of us, for our economy, our public services, and for building reconciliation. So the way forward, Taoiseach, is not to discard the agreement but to embrace it, to re-establish the Executive and the Assembly on the basis of equality and respect as was intended. And as you know, over the past year we've tried to do that. We reached an agreement with the DUP leadership to do so in February. They walked away, the thing collapsed. Listening to some of your ministers last night, Taoiseach, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the impasse in the north was entirely to be blamed on Sinn Féin, that we somehow were behind the RHI scandal, that we were denying fundamental rights to citizens. But you, of course, know the state of play, Taoiseach, and I'll tell you, Simon Coveney, your Taoiseach, that knows it even better. And yet your ministers Ring, Doherty, Griffin, engage in opportunistic sniping that is patently inaccurate and untrue. So you can't be a statesman one day and rejoice in the benefits of the peace process, Taoiseach, and then watch on as your ministers descend into the gutter with comments like those that were made last night. So I think it would be useful for you to discuss this at ministerial level, and perhaps it's a case that you're not actually briefing Cabinet accurately or fully. And if that's the case, I would ask you to remedy that situation, because the only way that we are finding a viable pathway back to full power sharing is with the active and fully informed engagement of everybody, and that crucially includes every member of your Cabinet.
7 minutes left. No, we'll take them in the order.
I'm interested, Taoiseach, in the discussions you've had in relation to the application for the Security Council membership, and it's an application that I and the Labour Party strongly support. In fact, have used our own contacts to advance. But I would just ask you in a general way, if you could tell us, has it in any way compromised our ability on the world stage to criticise countries as we look for their votes? You met with the Secretary-General of the Arab League, you say. I think that's a very important meeting. I had the privilege of meeting the Secretary-General last year when we were on the delegation to Egypt. But, for example, are we inhibited from criticising Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen? Are we clear in what we say internationally that although we're looking for people's support, we're not, if you like, holding our punches in our normal role? But I think that would be a mistake. I think it is important. If we ask people to support us, they'll know that we are honest brokers, and we will call out violations of human rights where we see it without fear or favour. And I think that's Ireland's strength in its application. And I'd be interested in hearing you set out that in clearer terms. In relation to the point made previously about the recognition of the State of Palestine, again, I think that is really an important position for us to advance now, and I know that every time that's been raised, although it was supported by all parties across the House, your general view is that that is contingent on a two-state solution. But things have moved remarkably badly in the wrong direction, particularly since the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States and the movement of the United States Embassy to Jerusalem. I think it is important that we are clear that we support a two-state solution, but in the interim that we would recognise the state of Palestine and the legitimate aspiration of the Palestinian people to their own state, which would include, of course, a capital in Jerusalem on an agreed basis.
Martin.
Thank you. Taoiseach, when Ireland has succeeded in being elected to the UN Security Council at regular intervals in the past, it has been through a relentless focus on diplomatic contacts. We've all been involved, and I was involved in previous governments in getting direction from foreign affairs in terms of the state of play. And this is why, Taoiseach, I think it has caused some surprise that the government decided to assign a marketing expert to the campaign. There's been a lot more showboating now, razzmatazz around this. One gets the sense for a domestic audience as opposed to the international reality of how these things happen and how you win an election to the Security Council. Can you explain, Taoiseach, I think people were surprised by how the former head of your Strategic Communications Unit was by your side in New York on Monday. Can you explain who he reports to and why you decided we needed marketing expertise in this bid? And was there a competition for the particular post that the person now occupies in line with normal procedure? In relation to the visit of President Abbas at the weekend, Taoiseach, can you explain whether you're any closer to clarifying what appears to be entirely contradictory policies in relation to Israel, Palestine and the occupied territories? Ireland's position as a country has been, and the Oireachtas in particular, has been consistently in favour of a two-state solution, as well as recognition of the humanitarian crisis, especially in Gaza. Given the efforts of Mr Netanyahu's government to effectively undermine any possibility of reaching a two-state solution, that's where we are now. It's been steady, consistent, to avoid any, and in fact to reduce the feasibility of a two-state solution eventually. The worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza, and we should acknowledge the negative role of Hamas in terms of that deteriorating humanitarian situation. The question is, does the international community act, or does it simply stand on the sidelines? Many states are now actively working to try and push back against Netanyahu's policies by recognising a Palestinian state and seeking new ways to combat illegal settlements. At each stage, our government has been resistant to action. In fact, we've been, don't like to use the word, but lectured by the Taoiseach about how we are damaging his efforts to bring peace to the region. I spoke in terms of the context of the Occupied Territories Bill with the Taoiseach. He is earnest, but he said to me, look, this could damage Ireland's role in peace and the perception of Ireland by the United States and so on. And he gave me the impression that a peace initiative was about to happen. But what actually did happen from the United States government was the antithesis of any movement towards peace. It took away its funding from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Organisation, which does extraordinary work in Gaza and the West Bank to feed people, to educate children. And I've been in the schools in Gaza where they teach the children of Gaza about the Holocaust and the atrocities and the horror of the Holocaust. And yet the one sort of civilising and significant humanitarian response to the crisis is being steadily undermined and eroded by the US government and by President Trump. And the bottom line is, and I've made this clear to the Taoiseach, people's patience is running out, Taoiseach, in terms of this Parliament's response and this government's response. So I just want to ask you, Taoiseach, specifically, if it is your view that targeting goods from illegal settlements is a problem in terms of EU law, what you're going to do to try to change this? Are you going to take any steps to implement the clearly expressed will of the Oireachtas? And finally, just on the peace process in the north, I would have to put it on the record that I think the Sinn Féin Ard Comhairle at the time should not have contrived to collapse the Assembly and the Executive. We now know from evidence that letters were written by Sinn Féin ministers pleading for the extension of RHI, or that we continue to be kept open. That is now out there in the public domain, and taking credit for that. And that is a problem. That is a problem in terms of very important institutions being undermined.
Taoiseach, I have never subscribed to the two-state solution when it comes to Palestine, because it codifies and institutionalises ethnic and religious partition of people, specifically Jewish people and Palestinian people, in a way that I don't think we would accept anywhere else, not least on this island. so I don't accept it. But setting aside that debate and the fact that the two-state solution in any way is falling apart because of Israel's complete flouting of every elementary sort of aspect of international law and human rights in relation to the Palestinians, what do you say in seeking nomination for Ireland to the UN Security Council about UN Resolution 194, the resolution that deals with the right of Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to the homes from which they were expelled and to recover the property which was lost when they were expelled, whether it was in 1948 or 1967. And I think in answering that question, you should consider the appalling conditions of refugees in refugee camps in Beirut. I was there in July. Absolutely shocking, worse than what you would see in the West Bank or in Jordan or in Syria. Do those refugees, as you seek to get Ireland onto the UN Security Council, do they have a right, as the marchers demanded in the Great March of Return, do they have the right to have that UN resolution vindicated and return to their homes in what is now called Israel? Because if you don't believe that, then I frankly think your aspiration to be on the UN Security Council is meaningless. Because the UN Security Council is completely selective in terms of its implementation of its own resolutions when it comes to the Palestinians. Equally, can I ask you to look at UN Resolution 55 and 56, which deal with the Kimberley process and conflict diamonds. Now, this is a process which the EU will now chair, and there's going to be a meeting on the 12th to the 16th of November where reforms of the Kimberley process will be discussed, and a big demand of those who support the Palestinian people, and indeed the Palestinian people themselves, is that Israel, because of its flouting of international law, its suppression of Palestinian rights, its continuous use of violence, which we saw most recently against the Great March of Return and the killing of about 170 people, its use of administrative detention, the shocking national law that was passed by Netanyahu recently, which has said now Israeli Palestinians do no longer have the right to self-determination, another tenet of international law within Israeli territory. Do you think, and will you champion, a demand that Israel is suspended from the Kimberley process and that its diamonds, which is a massive trade which finances the Israeli military, are suspended from the Kimberley process and that their diamonds are labelled conflict diamonds, as they absolutely are?
Ryan, for a short question.
I very much welcome your visit to the UN and our ongoing support of the UN. Will you, on behalf of the government, or who will, signal our disapproval as to what President Trump said yesterday in his UN speech? I don't know if you have a chance to see it yet, but it was beyond belief in my mind in the level of bellicose, threatening content. It was laughable in its arrogance if it was not so worrying in its intent. What's the diplomatic approach here? How can we comment on that? Will you comment on it? If not today, having had a chance to hear the speak, will the state, in the form of the government of Mr Taoiseach or yourself, make some response to what was said? Because I would ask you to listen to it and come back to me with what you think our suitable response is.
We're now on 25 minutes left and we should be in the second group, but I'll give the Taoiseach 5 minutes. There have been quite a few questions and we may not get to the third group. Taoiseach.
Thanks very much. In relation to refugees, my view and the position of the Irish Government is that all refugees should be allowed to return to their homes and recover any property expropriated from them, and that applies to all refugees, not just Palestinian refugees. I didn't have a chance to hear President Trump's speech in full. I did hear some extracts of it. I'm always reluctant to comment on extracts of a speech because things heard in their entirety are often different to sound bites, but I would certainly remark on two things. I would strongly disagree with his assertion that we should abandon globalism in favour of patriotism, which to me seemed to be a speech in favour of nationalism as opposed to globalism, and the Irish Government has a very different outlook in that regard. We're globalists by nature, and also I would be very much in line with our European colleagues in defending and supporting the Iran deal, which we believe has been successful in discouraging Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and we would stand with our European allies and colleagues in that regard, and disagreeing with President Trump's approach in relation to Iran. The government recognises the Palestinian people's right to statehood and to self-determination and their right to be treated decently. And the programme for government provides for the recognition of a Palestinian state as part of a two-state solution. It's important to point out that Palestine is not yet recognised by many other of our peer countries. Most OECD countries do not recognise Palestine as a state, including countries like Canada and Japan, America, Australia, New Zealand, most of the countries of Western Europe, France, Germany, Spain, Britain, the Benelux countries. I think one of the few exceptions in Western Europe is Sweden, and as a consequence of their recognition, the Israeli embassy was closed, relations were downgraded, Palestinians didn't benefit at all, and they endured some criticism from the United States for doing that, and I think we need to bear those things in mind in any decision that we make. When I met with President Abbas, I had the opportunity as well to raise with him concerns about the protection of the Christian minority in the Palestinian territories, a minority which has dwindled over the years. Also, the need to protect LGBT Palestinians, and they've yet to decriminalise, as you know, in Gaza. The decriminalisation has occurred in West Bank, but not in Gaza, and also the need to advance the rights of women. And I got a good engagement with them on those points, and they did respond to my concerns. I would just encourage other members, when they speak about Palestine, not to ignore those issues. We should be supportive of Palestinian statehood and self-determination, but we shouldn't turn a blind eye or be silenced, or allow ourselves to be silent when it comes to talking about the treatment of the Christian minority in the Middle East, in Palestine, the need to promote women, and the need to decriminalise homosexuality in Gaza. And I'm disappointed when people talk about Palestine, but seem to turn a blind eye to human rights issues and so on when it comes to that issue. They're also very grateful to Ireland for some of the things that we have done, supporting them in particular on the issue of Jerusalem, voting in the interests of Palestine in the General Assembly, in opposing the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, welcomed our support for their observer status and observer membership in the UN, and also welcomed the fact that we've increased our contribution to UNRWA after America reduced theirs. In terms of the trade bill that Deputy Martin asked about, our advice is that that legislation contravenes European law and therefore cannot be implemented, and would probably be struck down if challenged in the European courts. And that advice shouldn't come as any surprise, because trade is an exclusive EU competence, and individual countries can't make their own laws with respect to external trade. In terms of the Security Council campaign, I don't believe that our campaign in any way inhibits us from raising concerns about human rights or our objections to the actions of other states. I'm sure the countries that we're competing with, both Canada and Norway, will take the same view, that the fact that we're campaigning votes shouldn't restrain us in saying what needs to be said. In terms of Deputy Martin's question, the person you asked about is seconded to the Department of Foreign Affairs, reports to the Taoiseach, and as a communications professional is involved in the communications aspects of our campaign for SECO. On the Northern Ireland institutions, deputies will know now that Northern Ireland unfortunately holds the international record for failing to form a government, which I think is something of great regret, that we don't have devolved government in Northern Ireland, that people don't have an executive or an assembly to represent their interests, that we don't have north-south institutions functioning as they were for quite a number of years. And ultimately, while governments are there to support the parties, there cannot be an executive formed in Northern Ireland unless Sinn Féin and the DUP are able to do a deal. And both those parties have now broken the world record in being able to do a deal and form a government, and that is a deep regret. But I think to a certain extent Deputy McDonald perhaps protests too much in response to comments that my ministers made yesterday. It is a fact that Sinn Féin collapsed the Assembly and collapsed the Executive over the RHI controversy, and it may transpire when the inquiry is done that Sinn Féin knew more about it sooner than they had previously said. That's all history now, and we have to work together to try to get things going again. But that is the position. It's not all history.
We have to move on. Listen, we're moving on. I know.